Hi guys, we are going to do a couple of videos about chapter 2, section 1 on organizing data and graphs. We'll do one PowerPoint slide or one Google slideshow with several parts to it. So here we go. So in this chapter, we're going to talk about how to do a bunch of different graphs and analyze the data, where last chapter is about collecting data. So this time it's going to be displaying and analyzing, and these are the different sections that we're going to cover. Today we're going to focus on section 2.1. And there's going to be two main goals during this section, and the objectives are the two goals. One, how to construct a frequency distribution, including limits, class midpoints, relative frequencies, cumulative frequencies, and boundaries. And then we're also going to talk about how to do some more graphs, and those graphs are called histograms, frequency polygons, relative frequency histograms, and ogive graphs. And it's pronounced ogive, not ogive. Fun fact. So the first thing we're talking about is just a couple examples of frequency distribution and histograms. And you'll notice that there's an interval or a class that it says, in this example, one time there was some answer that was between 0 and 39. 5 times there was an answer that was between 40 and 79. And you can read for each of those. And then down here, this is an example of a histogram, which is a special type of graph, and we'll talk some more about that now. So the basic frequency table, organize your data into intervals. It could be intervals of time. It could be intervals of measurement, like how many shoes you have. Some people have 0 to 1. Some people have 2 to 3, or 0 to 5, 6 to 10, etc. And we usually stick between 5 to 20 intervals. If it gets more than that, it's hard to see patterns, and if it's less than 5, it's hard to see the patterns of what's going on. So you want at least 5 and at most 20 intervals most of the time. And when you figure out the class width, there's a couple things to do. You just take the range of your data, which is the highest number, and subtract it from the smallest number. And then you divide that range by the number of intervals, however many classes you want to use. And in this case, the number of classes that they wanted to use was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And no matter what answer you get here, you always round it up to the next whole number. Even if your answer is a whole number, you bump it up. So don't think of it as rounding, think of it as bumping up. And then the frequency f of a class is the number of times that data, that a number in your data shows up in that interval. So let's do an example, okay? So in this, let me move my face a little bit. So in this example, we're talking about 30 adults, 30 United States adults were asked how much did they spend above insurance, out of pocket, on prescription medicine in a recent year. And then they're asking us to construct a frequency distribution that has 7 classes. So here's all the answers. So somebody spent $200, somebody else spent $296. So they all spent different amount of money, and there are 30 people that they asked. So over on the left side, I'm going to tell you the different steps that you need to do, and then we're going to do that on the right side to this graph or to this data. So the first thing we need to do is decide on how many classes we want anytime you're making a frequency table. But in this case, they told us how many they wanted us to do. They told us they wanted us to do 7 classes. So we're going to split this information up into 7 groups. And the next thing you need to do is find the class width and round it up. And the way that you find the class width is you take your range and you divide it by the number of classes. Well, we have to find our highest numbers and our smallest number in this data. So I'm going to look around in this data and try and find the highest and the smallest. The highest, it looks like, is 405, and the smallest is in the 155. So I'm going to subtract those and divide by 7 because they said we're supposed to do 7 classes for this example. When I say class, a data class, we're talking about intervals, right? We're saying how big that group should be. So when you subtract and you get 250 and you divide by 7, you get about 35.7, and then remember you always bump it up to the next whole number. So we're saying our class width should be 36, okay? So we've done step 1. They did it for us. Decide how many classes you want, how many groups. Step 2, figure out the class width and round it up. Step 3 now is figure out the class limits. So what you do, so we're going to find the smallest number in our data set and then add to it that class width that we just found. And so our smallest number that we had in our data, our minimum, was 155, and our class width that we just found a second ago was 36. So we're going to add that together, and that tells us the next lower limit, the bottom of the next set of information. Well, then we just keep doing that. We add 36 and add 36 and add 36 until we get all 7 classes, the beginning of those classes, those widths. The lower limit is what it's called. And then to figure out the upper limit, we just go, well, it's got to go from 155 to all the way up to 190, you know, one less than the next one. So the next one would be 226 and 262 and 299, et cetera, et cetera. And that way, you just add 36 to find the lower limit, and then you subtract 1 from the next to find the upper limit. Okay, so now the next step in constructing a frequency table with that same data, it's all about the money and the prescription drugs. The next step is count how many of your original data is in each of those groups. So when we're looking at those groups, I'm going to go, okay, well, how many are in this first class? So I'm going to look through here and look for any number that's between 155 to 190. And when I did this earlier, I found 3 of those numbers. And so sometimes you can use making a tally mark chart helps for some people because you can just go through and go, okay, well, 200 is in this group and you put a mark. 239 is in this group and you put a mark. So the tally marks help some people to do that. But the goal here is to find the frequency, right? So according to this, where I've gone through and done this before, there are 6 adults who answered that they spent between $263 and $298 on their prescription drugs that year. And you always want to make sure that when you add up this frequency, that it adds up to the total number of the sample size or how many people you asked. And in this case, it should add up to 30. This little weird looking symbol, it looks like an E, is a fancy way to write sum or add up everything above it. So the sum of the frequencies is 30, which it should be because we said we asked 30 adults. So that's good. Next step. Now that we've got our frequency, we are now going to find the class midpoint. Now technically this alone already is a frequency table and it is basic and good. We're going to add some layers to it so we can use this information on other things that we do in a minute. So something we're going to do is these midpoints. And to find the midpoint of any 2 things, you just find their average. You add them up and divide by 2 if there's 2 numbers. If there are 3 numbers, you would add them up and divide by 3. Well, we're finding the midpoint or the average of these 2 numbers for this first class. So we're going to do 155 plus 190 divided by 2. And that tells us the class midpoint for this first class here, 172.5. That's the middle of that class, that interval. And then we do that all the way down and you get all these lovely answers. Now you're going to use that midpoint sometimes, and sometimes you're going to use what's called a relative frequency. Relative frequency. When you talk about relatives, you're talking about people that are connected to you. So relative frequency means look at the frequency and compare it to the total number of the sample size, how much and how many answers you got. So you always to find the relative frequency, you're going to figure out the class frequency and divide it by the sample size. Well, our sample size was 30 adults that we asked about their spending on medicine. So I'm going to take this 3 and divide it by that 30, and that tells me 0.1 or 10% of the adults that we asked were in this range, were in this class interval. So 0.1 or 10%. And then you do that with each of the frequencies. You take this number and you divide it by 30. This number and you divide it by 30 and you get 0.17. 6 divided by 30 gives you 0.2. 7 divided by 30 gives you 0.23. Now these, if we're talking percents of the whole thing, if we were to add those relative frequencies up, they should add to 100%, or the decimal would be 1. The frequency, when you add those up, they should add up to the total number of answers, otherwise known as your sample size. Okay. So we can also find what's called the cumulative frequency. Cumulative means as you add them up. So in this case, you're only going to look at the frequency and the frequency before it to figure out the next. So let me move this over here. So the first frequency is 3. The cumulative frequency of the next class, I add that old 3 plus the new 2, and I get 5. Then I'm going to add that old 5 plus the new 5 and get 10. Add that old 10 plus the new 6 and get 16, and you keep going down. By the end, you should get to your total number of adults that you asked, or your sample size. And that would give you the cumulative frequency. Now, we just did a whole bunch of different pieces, and then you start putting it all together and answering questions about it. So here's the whole table. This is the expanded frequency distribution chart from that example that we've been talking about with expenses that people had on prescription drugs above their insurance. And to look at some of the patterns, you might say, okay, well, I mean, what do you notice about this, or what's important to notice? One thing that would certainly be important to notice is that the biggest percent of what's going on, the biggest chunk, the most common range for the expenses, most people in that group spent between $299 to $334. Another thing you could look at if you use the cumulative frequency is that about half of the 30 spent $298 or less, right? That's what this cumulative means. So when they get up to about half of what the original sample size was, it was 30. So about half of that's 15. So about half of the people spent under $299. And those are the different things you want to look for. The next video will be, okay, so what are some graphs we can use to go with this? And one of them is going to be what's called a histogram.